Final ending of The Wall, Part 1 down below. He gave me a close look, and I think he decided to use you as the messenger as payback for resisting his advances. My face flushed, reddening first from embarrassment and then from rage. I didn't like being used by Scott, but I was more worried about Peter. I was alarmed by the tone of his voice. "What are you going to do now?" I inquired. For a brief moment, he balled his fists tightly before releasing them. "I won't be doing anything right now other than focusing on getting ready for Expo. I really cannot afford to lose my job right now. But when it's done, you can count on me to get a divorce from Callie and find a way to make amends with Scott. Peter, I can relate to some of your feelings right now because I've been betrayed in the past. Tell me if there is anything I can do to help. However, whatever you choose, avoid taking any actions that could cause you harm." "I appreciate it, Jess," he murmured. "Thank you for that. I also recognize how brave you must have been to tell me about this. Right now, the only thing I would ask is that you keep what you've learned to yourself. The only thing I know to help with the pain, as for me, is to immerse myself in my work." He gave me a wry look. "It will also give me an excuse to stay away from Callie." I felt like my heart was going to burst as I turned to leave and took one last look at him. Seeing a nice, decent man have his entire life fall apart on top of him was heartbreaking. With just a few workdays remaining before Expo, the tension seemed to be building daily. Naturally, there was some tension due to the pressure of meeting deadlines for such a significant event. But this time there was also a strong dislike between marketing and sales that appeared to affect nearly every member of the two teams. The stories surrounding Mr. Moffat were adding gasoline to the flames. Not only did the conversation at the water cooler suggest that he was about to retire, but rumors of Scott Benson taking his place were also starting to spread. As a result, those who worked with Peter were unhappy and fearful of working in a corporate setting under Scott's authority, while those who were part of Scott's team became more obedient than ever in an attempt to win over Scott. I frequently offered Peter's group assistance whenever I could, and I eventually became something of a de facto member. I got a few curious looks when I sat down at the lunch table with them the first few times, but they accepted me because Peter was clearly approving of me. They therefore did not try to conceal from me their reactions to everything that was happening. Their zeal for Scott was almost shocking in its intensity. The common refrain was, if he gets the VP slot, it will be a disaster for the company. Why would senior management even consider promoting such a terrible boss? Was a different question. Hearing that competent, capable employees would quit the company if Scott was appointed vice president was unsettling. However, they had the same low opinion of Scott and the same regard for Peter. On multiple occasions when Peter was not present, one of his people offered anecdotal evidence of how Peter had assisted in resolving an issue. He had a way of making helpful recommendations that motivated the recipient to go back and improve. The course of action for the company seemed apparent to me, but I was aware that executives frequently prioritize the short-term profit margin over long-term considerations. It was painfully obvious to me that Peter was getting close to breaking point if there was a lot of stress on his group. I was terrified that something would break because of the pressing deadline, his rivalry with Scott, and the almost unbearable Callie revelations. I went to Peter's office 2 days prior to Expo starting because I was so worried about him. I was confident I would find him there, even though it was far past regular work hours, and I wasn't let down. A few of his important associates were gathered around him, intently staring at something on his computer screen. I stopped at his door and watched him intently because I didn't want to interrupt him. Though I knew he was worn out from working long hours, the lines and shadows on his face told me of another burden that only I was aware of. I was disturbed by it, but I was at a loss for what I could do to assist. It was then that he looked up and saw me. "Hey, Jess," he said, pointing to something on his monitor. "Come in and have a look at this." I turned to face him and peered over his shoulder, but all I saw seemed to be a view of an empty room with curtains hanging around the walls. I uttered an unsure "That's nice, what am I looking at?" "We're testing this new setup. This is a live feed from our hospitality suite at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, which you are now viewing." With pride, Peter said. He continued, tapping the keyboard. "Now watch this," he said. The scene changed to a wide hall. Peter's focus narrowed to a major exhibit that was still under construction as he zoomed in. "That's the booth at Expo, or it will be as soon as the display people get everything set up," he stated. I was confused as I looked at him. "Why exactly do you need a live feed from Expo?" I inquired. Peter did not respond. Instead, he gestured to one of the women. "Debbie, you came up with the idea. Tell Jess what you've got in mind." She started babbling like a happy child at show and tell right away. "It will be fantastic," she exclaimed. "We'll be able to monitor the booth setup in real time and make any necessary adjustments. Once a show begins, it may help us gauge the positive or negative reactions of our patrons. It might also provide a chance for staff members at the headquarters to observe firsthand what transpires at a show like this and how their efforts are put to use." As she was speaking, a few other members of the team started bringing up new uses and potential improvements. Peter turned to face me as they carried on their animated conversation. "Jess, this is something we've never done before. We plan to test it out for Expo, and if it performs as expected, it will provide us with a fresh approach to marketing at the next major event. That truly is remarkable, I uttered with sincerity. I'll bet Mr. Moffat will be impressed when he sees it. Debbie threw up a sour expression and jerked her head at the mention of Mr. Moffat's name. I wish he'd be impressed enough to recommend Peter, not Scott Benson, she said. Then she realized that I was employed by Mr. Moffat, and she embarrassed herself by clapping her hand over her mouth. She said defensively, I didn't mean that the way it sounded, but I could tell she had meant every word. And I totally agreed with her, even though I remained silent. However, Debbie's remarks seemed to ignite a flurry of emotion, and other people started to add their own observations. Peter tried to defuse the situation by speaking up right away. We're all a little anxious about potential outcomes, but they're beyond our control. Let us focus on our responsibilities and allow senior management to handle whatever comes its way. Another person spoke up. Yeah, but if Scott winds up with the VP job, life here is going to be a living hell. You're right, said someone else. Why can't they see what a terrible leader Scott would make? Peter's head snapped up at that last comment. As I watched him, he asked, what if they could see? What if they had a chance to see the real Peter in action? That would be perfect, a person commented, but how could we make that happen? After Peter presented his concept, the office was filled with animated conversations and ideas being exchanged. I watched the interaction while leaning back against a wall. The objections eventually came together to form a plan, and their initial excitement gave way to a purpose. After the commotion had mostly died down, Peter raised his hand to signal for everyone to pay attention. People, there's something we all need to know. Pay attention. This conversation we are having could potentially open some eyes in the executive suite, but it could also go horribly wrong. So let's just agree that I will be the one to blame if something goes wrong. We must arrange things so that no one else's involvement is apparent. There was instant opposition, but Peter persisted, and eventually the others reluctantly accepted. Although they were supportive of Peter and loyal to him, I believe that at their core, none of them could afford to lose their jobs in the event that their little ploy backfired. However, I felt that Peter's desire to defend his team, even if it meant jeopardizing his own employment, was admirable. Peter asked me to stay behind after he adjourned the meeting and sent everyone home. He gave me a close-up once everyone else had left. Jess, you're going to play a crucial part if this crazy plan has any chance of succeeding. We'll do our best to conceal your involvement, but there's a good chance it will be discovered. Do you really want to take that chance? I pondered over it and asked myself what my true feelings were. I was aware that working as Scott's executive assistant would be unbearable, and that he would make a terrible vice president. I detested what Scott had done to Peter as well, and it was made worse by the fact that Scott had communicated with me. My sympathy for Peter grew as a result of those thoughts, which also brought back memories of my own unsuccessful marriage. I was even more determined to assist Peter. Count me in, I firmly informed Peter. I want to help you any way I can. He said, Jess, thanks. That really means a lot to me. Peter and other members of his team flew to Vegas the day before Expo opened to finalize preparations. There would be constant demonstrations once the show formally opened. When Expo first launched, I would take breaks from my work to visit the trials control room that Peter's team had set up at the headquarters to see what was going on. I could watch a live feed from the Expo floor while seated in front of an oversized monitor. Peter was always working with our product demonstrators or having conversations with some of the display personnel. When the monitor was changed to the hospitality suite, that was the only occasion I saw Scott. There, you could frequently see him chit-chatting with a senior researcher or purchasing executive from one of our clients. Scott appeared to be doing a decent job, based on what I could see. It was not planned for Peter's plan to start until the last night of Expo. In addition to making sure nothing would obstruct the business's sales efforts, he wanted to catch Scott off guard and when the pressure was off. However, as the deadline drew nearer for the handful of us who knew about the plan, the tension continued to rise. Everything was meticulously planned out and scheduled down to the last minute. There was nothing more we could do, so we had to wait, which was nerve-wracking. I had remained seated at my desk on the final day of Expo so as not to interfere. I nearly leaped out of my seat that afternoon when my phone finally rang. I knew it was my cue to begin when I answered the phone and saw that nobody else was on the line. In a hurry, I went into Mr. Moffat's office to get his phone. Though he was strong in many areas, communications technology was not one of them. When he went out of town, he typically left his smartphone at the office and used it very infrequently. I quickly thumbed in a text message after picking it up and making sure he had indeed done so this time. After entering all the information, I quickly made my way to the control center that Peter's group had set up. Before I completed my task, there were still a few steps to take. The view from the hospitality suite was shown on the large monitor. With most of them holding drinks, Scott and his team members were mingling as they celebrated the successful conclusion of yet another important show. Although only a handful of his teammates were present, Peter was also there. Peter looked up to where he knew the cameras were and nodded slightly after checking his watch. It was game on. The woman I had met in Peter's office earlier, Debbie, bowed down in front of the monitor, leaned over the microphone and said, "Roger that, we are go for launch." Peter nodded again, clearly picking up on her words through the tiny microphone in his ear. With a quiet voice, she flicked a switch and said, "Commence stage 1. With a covert nod, one of Peter's operatives in the room moved to speak with a sales representative for Scott. He extended his hand to the salesman and started congratulating him. The salesman's smile could be seen on his face even from a distance. Debbie changed the setting on the speaker switch and gave the same directions again. While we observed, one of Peter's product representatives approached another member of Scott's group and struck up a conversation with him. The man's expression changed to one of surprise, and even though we couldn't hear him, it seemed like he was seeking clarification. As several more members of Peter's team carried out the same procedure, we could see that Scott's team was becoming more and more excited. With tense lips, Debbie cast a quick glance at me over her shoulder. She said, "The word is beginning to spread. Get ready." I kept a close eye on the screen as Peter made a small adjustment to something beneath his jacket, and all of a sudden we could hear the sound of material rustling as he approached his opponent. "Well, Scott," he said, holding out his hand, "it appears that you have prevailed. Many congratulations." "What are you talking about, Peter?" With a suspicious snarl, Scott declined the offered hand. "I recently learned that during this afternoon's executive committee meeting, Mr. Moffat declared his retirement." Peter remarked, "I have also heard that you were chosen by the committee to be his successor." Scott was seen cautiously glancing at Peter on the screen. "I'm not aware of any such information." "Hamill, what kind of game are you attempting to play?" At that moment, a member of Scott's entourage approached and started giving him back pats. "Congrats, boss. We recently learned of the development. What's new? What topic are you discussing?" The salesperson remained unfazed. "Scott, it's all over the show. You will take over as the vice president of sales and marketing." Another one of his people approached to congratulate him as Scott cast an uncertain glance at him. When Debbie panned in on Scott's face, we could see exultation clashing with reluctance. Scott waved his hand a little. Debbie gave me a second look. "That signals to you," she said. I produced the text message I had prepared, held up Mr. Moffat's smartphone, and hit send. My hands were starting to get a little sweaty. Scott leaped as if he had been shocked, so it was evident when the text was received. He swiftly took his smartphone from his pocket to view the text message he had just received. Because Peter and I had carefully composed it, I knew what he was reading. "Well done, Scott. I made my retirement announcement at ExecCom today. You'll take over as my vice president. We'll speak in my office tomorrow." "Moffat." "Yes." Scott pounded his fist in the air and yelled, I knew it, I knew it." Slapping his phone down at Scott, he said, "Hamill, read this and cry." More of his people gathered around Scott right away. Those who wanted to be loyal scurried to shake his hand and offer obedient praise. A bottle of champagne and glasses were brought over for a toast, and someone else went to the soundboard to turn on a boisterous pop song. With the alcoholic beverages flowing and the spontaneous celebration getting underway, Peter pushed his way back to Scott's side and gave his phone back. "Well, Scott," he replied, "do you have any big changes in mind, or will you be continuing the course that Mr. Moffat set?" After finishing his glass of champagne, Scott leaned in Peter's direction, an ugly expression on his face. "It's safe to assume that there will be modifications." Moffat was an obese, elderly jerk who struggled to attract women to the French Foreign Legion. "I plan to significantly transform the organization, beginning with the marketing division. Moffat put up with mediocrity for far too long. It's time to start trimming the excess. And, Peter, in case you haven't guessed it already, my stance is that you should start your search for Rod at the top of the department. I see that you might want to update your resume." In a heart-stopping moment, I thought Peter was going to punch him out and ruin everything, but then he stuck his finger into Peter's chest. Peter, however, maintained his composure and said, "We'll see, Scott, we'll see." Now that the group was gathering around Scott, they pulled him away from the altercation, and over the commotion, we could hear Scott saying, "Come on, everybody, it's time to party. I'll pay for the drinks." Peter pivoted, turning to face the cameras he knew were concealed there. "All right," he uttered softly, "I believe we achieved our goal. Please tell everyone in our group to leave the hospitality suite right away. I don't want any conflicts." Subsequently, as he adjusted the microphone, the sound abruptly stopped. Debbie gave a few brief instructions at the control desk, and we watched as Peter's people quietly left the suite. She turned to me and shot me a fierce, victorious look when the last of them were gone. She cried, "We did it!" When Moffat and the other executives see that little outburst, they'll get a picture of the real Scott Benson, and I don't think they're going to like what they see. It felt too good to be true. I wanted to dance. Indeed, there could be inquiries regarding Scott's perception of his promotion, but I believed that Mr. Moffat and other individuals would overlook them considering the awful things Scott had just blurted out. He had insulted Mr. Moffat directly, but he had also insulted the marketing department indirectly by attacking it. I had no doubt that Mr. Moffat was impressed with the work that Peter's team had produced, and that he had given Peter high marks on his annual review. No, I was certain Scott's fate would be sealed by those remarks. I ended up going into work early the following morning because I couldn't sleep well that night, either in spite of or perhaps because of the tension we'd all felt. After every major show, Mr. Moffat held a post-mortem, and I was eager to see how this one turned out. When I arrived at the office, the executive suite was empty, so I made the decision to dash over to Peter's area to see if any of his team members were around. However, I was shocked to see Debbie hunched over her keyboard, sobbing uncontrollably. When I arrived at the control room, I cried out, "Debbie, Debbie, what's wrong? What is it?" With bloodshot eyes, she gazed up at me and exclaimed, "It's gone, it's all gone." "What's gone?" I nervously inquired. "All the footage from the hospitality suite last night," she stated. "I had it all stored on a server, and during the night the server went down. Now it's all gone and we don't have a backup. Everything's ruined." I glanced up to see Peter enter after hearing a noise behind me. His face went paler. He'd clearly heard what Debbie had said. I said, "What are we going to do, Peter?" He shook his head slowly back and forth. "I don't know what we can do. This could turn out bad, very bad." To my surprise, he stood up, approached Debbie, and started comforting her. "Don't worry, Deb," he reassured her. "It wasn't your fault. Your system worked perfectly and you did a wonderful job keeping everything on plan. Sometimes bad things just happen." She sobbed, "I should have created a backup." He comfortingly remarked, "Those servers never give us any trouble. No one could have expected a system crash." He was staring at me. "You better get up to your office. If there's any way you can stall Mr. Moffat, that would be great. I'll try to think of something." I tried not to cry as I nodded and made my way back to the elevator. Not only was Scott's incriminating display of haughtiness and indifference absent, but Peter would now need to attempt to defend his actions in misleading his fellow director. It all seemed to have burned to ashes not so long ago, everything that had seemed so perfect. I hurried to my desk after getting off the elevator and tried to look nice so Mr. Moffat wouldn't see how angry I was. I need not have worried, though, because as soon as I was settled in, he stormed in and it was clear that he was furious. "Ms. Martin, call Scott Benson's office and get him up here immediately," he yelled. I called Scott's office with trembling fingers and got Karen. I popped my head into Mr. Moffat's office after hanging up. I informed him. His secretary said he isn't in yet. She said he was late getting back from Las Vegas last night and hasn't made it into the office. He angrily said, "Well, tell her I want to see him the instant he arrives. And then get Peter Hamill up here." "Yes, sir," I said, attempting to control my shaking voice. Peter picked up the phone when I called his office. "Oh, Peter, Mr. Moffat wants you and Scott up here ASAP," I replied. I then spoke more softly. "And he's madder than a hornet's nest," I continued. Peter sighed and said, "Okay, Jess, I'll be right there," in a tone that suggested resignation. Peter looked like a man who had been sentenced to death when he walked into the office. With a feeble smile, he left me to face his destiny. "It'll probably be my fate too," I believed, when Mr. Moffat finds out what I did. Scott could have joined the meeting through the open door to Mr. Moffat's office, and I'm not ashamed to say that I was listening in. However, my heart was beating so loudly that it was still difficult for me to hear what was being said. There were no formalities today, Mr. Moffat being the true gentleman he was normally. "What do you know about the shenanigans that went on at the hospitality suite yesterday evening?" Peter was asked. "Well," Peter said, "after Expo formally ended, we all congregated back in the hospitality suite to unwind before going back to our rooms to pack. Then, before Peter could say anything more, Scott Benson, sporting a smug smile on his face despite his somewhat rough appearance, stormed into the office. I saw him sneer at Peter and then turn to look at Mr. Moffat. "Sorry I'm late, boss, but the celebration last night got a little wild." Mr. Moffat gave him a fierce look. He insisted, "And just what were you celebrating?" Scott gave him a strange look. As if Mr. Moffat were a schoolboy, he said, "My team wanted to celebrate my promotion to VP to succeed you after you retire." "What are you talking about, Benson? I haven't announced any plans to retire." Scott brashly said, "Yeah, you did announce it at the executive committee meeting yesterday." Mr. Moffat erupted, "I most certainly did not, nor was there any discussion of any successor." I glanced over at Peter. Scott's discomfort wasn't something he was enjoying because he knew where this conversation was going to end. However, Scott would not be deterred. He said, "Of course you did," and he smirkily held up his smartphone, saying, "I have your text message right here." Mr. Moffat gave him a shocked look. He stated unequivocally, "I never sent you any such text." With one hand holding the phone and the other to bring up his text message list, Scott replied, "Sure you did," turning on his phone. "I'll show you." Then he cursed and started furiously thumbing through the list. At last, he halted and raised his head. He exclaimed angrily, "It's been erased. Someone must have deliberately erased it." I thought I saw a smirk play on Peter's lips, but when Scott turned to face him, all I saw was blank expression. Scott, though, wasn't done. To everyone's surprise, he reached across Mr. Moffat's desk and grabbed his phone with confidence. Not even password protected. He muttered to himself before using Mr. Moffat's text messaging feature. Nothing was on the list. Scott yelled, "Where are all your texts?" After working with Mr. Moffat for a while, I knew he was getting angrier by the minute. I don't send text messages. If I want to communicate with someone, I call them." Scott cast an accusing glance around. He looked at Peter for a moment before turning to face me. "Someone sent me a text message announcing my promotion, and now they've erased the evidence on my phone and on yours," he exclaimed. I slipped back behind the door with haste. "Young man," said Mr. Moffat, "none of this is important. We're having this meeting because I want to know what went on in the hospitality suite last night. Would you care to explain?" "There's really nothing to explain," hurriedly stated Scott. "After somebody misled me into believing I had been promoted, my team and I had a little celebration, that's all. It wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been the victim of a malicious prank." Mr. Moffat said, "I see," in a foreboding way. Then he raised his head. "Ms. Martin, would you come help me, please?" He gestured to his computer when I rushed to his side. "Can you set this damned thing up so we can look at some pictures I got by email?" I scurried over to his keyboard and widened the window to fill the screen. "It's all set," I told him. "All right," he remarked. He glanced at Peter and Scott as I said, "Now, please check my email for one from Lucas Masterson." "Does the name Lucas Masterson mean anything to either of you?" Scott replied quickly, "Of course. Lucas Masterson is president of Masterson Industries, our biggest single customer." "Excellent, Scott," Mr. Moffat said in a condescending manner. "And would you agree that we would always want to impress Mr. Masterson with our professionalism and competence?" Scott stated, of course, sporting a perplexed expression. Mr. Moffat's voice was ominous now. "An old friend of mine named Lucas called me late last night." With hesitation, I pushed the button to launch the slideshow. The opening image featured a group of our sales team members mingling at the hospitality suite bar, seemingly helping themselves to the alcohol. The next slide showed Scott standing on a makeshift stage that had been set up next to the bar, holding a bottle of beer and encouraging the people below him to cheer. I noticed that the company name and logo were directly behind the stage, and I knew that Mr. Moffat wouldn't be pleased to see that included in the picture. The story behind the logo was that it was an upright hand with the index finger making the number 1 sign. The next picture, however, was worse. In addition to Scott, there were now 2 young ladies standing beside him, and he was encircling both of them with his arms. I looked over at Peter and silently muttered, "Who are they?" In ignorance, he shrugged his shoulders. The next photo showed Scott dancing with the 2 women on stage, and from the way I saw them, I got the impression that all 3 of them were pretty inebriated, especially since it looked like the 2 women were doing a striptease, which clearly delighted Scott. A collective gasp went up in the room when the next picture appeared on screen. To the audience's cheers, Scott was fondling one of the nymphets who had lost all of her clothes. The next shot appeared on screen before I could stop it, showing Scott playing with the obliging young woman like a toy, a 3-dimensional model of the company logo. "Switch it off," Mr. Moffat yelled. I quickly turned off the monitor to cover up the offensive picture. "Mr. Benson, you embarrassed yourself last night more than once." Red in the face, Scott yelled angrily, "Wait a minute, I'm the victim here. None of this would have happened if I hadn't been tricked into believing I'd been promoted." Mr. Moffat roared, "Thank God you weren't promoted." Then he managed to gather himself a little. "It doesn't make the slightest difference to me why you acted the way you did. The fact remains that your behavior was totally outrageous and completely unacceptable. Even if the head of our best customer hadn't walked in and seen the debauchery, you would still have been setting a terrible example for your own people." With a sudden turn of events, he turned to face me. "Ms. Martin, come on over here, HR and security. Have them escort Mr. Benson back to his office and give them 15 minutes to clear his desk of any personal belongings." I squeaked, "Yes, sir," and hurried to place the calls. I heard Scott shouting behind me, "Hamo, this is all your fault. I was set up by you." But before he could do or say anything more, one of our security personnel arrived and began to escort Scott away. As they waited for the elevator, Peter came out of Mr. Moffat's office and walked up beside Scott. I was out in the hallway looking for the HR representative, so I was just able to hear what Peter whispered to Scott. "You screwed my wife, now you're the one who's screwed." While I turned to head back to the office, Peter said softly, "When you get a chance, please come see me." Scott growled like an animal, but the security man moved quickly to separate them. The head of HR and the 3 of them boarded the elevator and rode down. "I need to discuss everything with you." I hurried back to Mr. Moffat's door after giving him my word that I would. "Mr. Moffat, is there anything I can do for you?" I inquired. It was evident from the tired look in his eyes that all of this had taken a toll on him when he said, "Yes, Ms. Martin, there are 3 things I actually need. First and foremost, I sincerely apologize for forcing you to look at those explicit photos. I had forgotten about Scott's foreplay, but at least I stopped them before the picture of him sleeping with that little tramp." I nodded, grinning, and expressed my gratitude for his sensitive gentlemanship. "The second thing you could do would be to try to get Lucas Masterson on the phone so I can apologize to him again and let him know what steps I've taken this morning to ensure this debacle will not be repeated. And once you've reached Lucas, could you please get those damned photographs off my computer and phone?" he said as I turned to return to my desk. "I wish to never see them once more. I don't know who led Scott to believe he'd been promoted," he said, causing my heart to leap into my throat. But I think I owe him, or her, a debt of gratitude for helping reveal Scott's true nature. I couldn't be certain, but I think I saw the tiniest of smiles on his face before he resumed his normal manner. Now about that phone call to Lucas, I said, nodding. I scurried off to my desk, he said. By lunchtime, rumors about Scott's termination had spread throughout the building, and I tried to steer the conversation away from the topic, reasoning that I had been too close to the story to be comfortable, and that I didn't want to add to the already existing speculation about my role. However, I did make a point of stopping by Peter's office to tell him what Mr. Moffat had said to me, in the hopes that it would reassure Peter that nothing more was about to happen. I thought he would be very relieved, but when I was done, I could still see the fatigue in his face, and that worried me. So I asked him the question that had been bothering me since this morning, ever since I saw the incriminating slideshow. Peter, who were those two women with Scott? I don't know for sure, but I suspect they were Freebirds, he said, grinning at me a little. Seeing my look of confusion, he continued, we get them at almost every trade show. They are people who enter the show covertly in search of free alcohol, food, and parties in the hospitality suites, and they could be open to some unpaid bonding if the circumstances are ideal. You have never, I began, but he quickly cut me off, saying, never, with such firmness that only a fool would risk being exposed to whatever diseases they might have in the first place. In addition, I'm a devoted husband. His expression turned sour, and he stopped suddenly. I felt sorry for him. When are you going to confront her, then? I questioned gently. When I get home from work today, he grumbled. I've been working with an attorney and I'm going to give Callie the papers in person tonight. I'm so sorry, Peter, I said gently. I've been so focused on this mess with Scott that I almost forgot about her. Peter, I don't know if it would help, but I haven't deleted those photos that Lucas Masterson took. An idea suddenly occurred to me. Do you want a copy to be printed for you? After giving it some thought, he nodded. Yes, please. I'd like to show Callie just what kind of man she chose over me. He grumbled. He was getting ready to leave when I went back to his office to give him the prints I'd made. I want to be waiting for her when she gets home, he stated to me. Besides, I might as well get out of here. I won't be worth a damn until I get this over with. I comprehend, I replied to him. But if you'd like to talk about it afterwards, I'll be here. Thanks, he replied. I'd like that. You're really the only one who knows what's going on. I turned down Marge's invitation to go out for a drink that evening. The drama that had unfolded that morning had worn me out, and now I worried about Peter. I was fixated on the conflict he was in, and I knew that Marge would find me to be a terrible companion. I couldn't sleep for the second consecutive night, so I ended up coming into the office early in the hopes of seeing Peter. When he came, I was waiting outside his office, and he thanked me for bringing him a cup of coffee. I couldn't wait to ask him how Callie was doing when we were sitting on the couch and armchair in his office. To be honest, he replied quietly, my emotions are all over the place. I feel a lot of bitterness toward Callie for cheating on me, yet I can't help feeling depressed that my marriage is ending. I'm glad that Scott got what he deserved, but I feel wrung out by the whole experience. More than anything else, Jess, I just feel exhausted. I know it's bad, Peter, but I promise you that it will get better, I replied. The story was the talk of the town for the next few weeks, despite the executive's best efforts to hide the events that led to Scott's humiliating dismissal. Too many people knew at least part of the story. Strangely, the group most willing to spread rumors was Scott's former colleagues, possibly as payback for how he had handled them during his tenure as their manager. While most of Peter's team members maintained their anonymity, it was evident that they were happy with the result. Sadly, the backstory of Scott's involvement in Peter and Callie's divorce also spread like wildfire through the hallways. Although no one confronted Peter about it directly, whispers and covert remarks started as soon as he left the room. For his sake, I detested that, but there was nothing I could do to keep him safe. Given my level of knowledge, I was only able to remain silent about the entire issue. To make sure Peter was doing well, I did make an effort to stay in touch with him as frequently as I could. I noticed that I was always trying to think of reasons to stop by his office during the day or join his team for lunch. Occasionally, Marge would stop by and, after work, take me to her favorite pub. She was the CEO's assistant, so I'm sure she knew almost as much about what had transpired as I did, but she never brought it up during our brief excursions. She did, however, make it a point to ask how Peter was doing, and I did my best to update her on what I had noticed. I had only been involved in a supporting role, so it seemed strange to me that she kept asking how I was doing. However, she kept asking, and I would always tell her that everything was okay. 4 months or so later, I received a call one afternoon from Debbie, the person who had assisted Peter at the control desk during Expo. She informed me that after work, his team was planning a small, surprise celebration for Peter, and she asked if I would like to attend. She informed me that Peter's divorce had recently become final when I asked her what the occasion was. I told her that I would be there, of course. The gathering was held in a private room of a bar that a lot of the marketing staff frequently visited. Upon my arrival, the room was adorned with absurd banners featuring phrases such as "Free at last," "Peter is available," and "Look out ladies." Although I found it quite juvenile and tasteless, it seemed that others shared my opinion. The crowd was rapidly depleting multiple kegs of beer, which contributed to the high decibel level of noise. Although I thought it was great that his team thought so highly of Peter, I got the impression from watching him in the crowd that he wasn't taking part in the celebration to the same extent as the others. When someone persuaded him to speak, he eventually got up on a table despite his best efforts to resist. But rather than digressing into comedy, he made brief but direct remarks. He thanked everyone for the celebration and acknowledged their hard work at Expo once more before extending an invitation for them to continue having fun. Then he leaped back down into the throng with haste. I hurried over to him as the party started up again, and we snatched up an empty table and settled in. "Jess, thank you for coming," he said. "How do you like the party?" The lines around his eyes were still visible when I closely examined his face. More to the point, "How do you like it, Peter?" I responded. He tried to keep a cheerful expression, but it fell away, and it was obvious how unhappy he was. I know I'm supposed to be all fired up and excited about being a bachelor again, but honestly, what I feel right now is depressed, and I'm not even sure why. I think I can tell you, because that's exactly the way I felt after divorcing my husband. My guess is that you're down because you're mourning the loss of your marriage. But that doesn't make sense, Jess. I don't want to be married to Callie anymore, not after the things she did and the way she treated me. There's no way I could ever trust her again, he roared. Of course not, I reassured her. But what you're mourning is something different. You probably always pictured yourself in a committed relationship. Maybe you wanted to start a family at some point. Callie destroyed all that. It's no wonder you feel depressed. You've lost the picture of how your life would be. After giving me a long, hard look, he slowly nodded. He gave me another look and said, "There's a lot of truth in that, Jess. Thanks for being such a good friend." At that moment, a few of his coworkers approached and seized his arm. They dragged him away after saying, "This won't do, too much solemnity, too much sobriety. Come on, Peter." But before he went, he waved and grinned at me. Not long after, I slipped out the door and went home. That kind of partying isn't my thing, but I felt good about helping Peter, and I couldn't stop grinning all the way home. I kept waiting for Peter to get better, to emerge from his depression, now that he was divorced. He was obviously recovering in some ways, but that didn't seem to show in the way he behaved, at least not with me. When he saw me, he would wave and smile, and when we spoke, we still seemed to be thinking alike. However, I never seemed to find what more I was searching for. Mr. Moffat called me into his office a week or two later. He motioned for me to take a seat after asking me to close the door. "Please keep what I'm about to tell you in confidence," Ms. Martin said the man. "You recall that executive committee meeting that happened during Expo? Well, I did tell the committee that I was going to retire, but they asked me to stay on and try to clean up the mess that Scott Benson had caused as soon as I learned about it. But as of right now, everything appears to be going fairly smoothly, so I'm going to carry out my plans to step down. After lunch today, I'll make the announcement, but I wanted to let you know in advance so you wouldn't be taken off guard. Although I was surprised by his news, I appreciated his courtesy toward me. It's also important for you to know that Peter Hamill will be your new boss," he stated. "I'm hoping the news will make you happy." I got up to give him a big hug, and he beamed at me and gave me some very nice compliments before asking me to call Peter and ask him to come up. "Oh, Mr. Moffat, I'm delighted for Peter, but you've been so wonderful to work for. I'm really going to miss you." Following their meeting, I made sure to congratulate Peter on his well-deserved promotion when he emerged from the two of them. "Thanks, Jess," he said warmly. "That really means a lot to me." His warmth followed me out of the office for a little while, but as I thought about it more, the feeling dwindled until by afternoon I was in a blue mood. "Marge, I have some things I need to do at home," I told her when she asked to go to the tavern after work at the end of the day. She wouldn't take no for an answer, and I guess that's part of what makes her so valuable to the CEO, her absolute doggedness in pursuing her goals, so I gave in. After we took a seat in the tavern, she leaned over the table and gave me a stern look. "All right, Jess, tell me what's bothering you." "Marge, I have no idea what you're talking about," I objected. "False. You've been moping around for the last few weeks like a little kid with a sick dog, and today you're acting like your dog died," she said, which shocked me because Marge hardly ever swears. "I would have assumed that working for Peter would make you happy. Tell me what's not right." "Peter's promotion is the last straw, Marge," I said to myself as I tried not to cry. Suddenly, something inside of me gave way and I found myself wiping away tears. I simply don't think I can handle being so close to him and seeing him every day. "Why not, Jess? I don't get it. I know that his wife's affair and their divorce were difficult for him, but I thought that after the divorce was finalized, he would feel more at ease with me and perhaps even want to get together or go out with me," I sniffed. "However, he still treats me like a friend and a member of the group whenever I see him. It's killing me." She gave me a pitying glance and said, "You really are suffering for him, aren't you? You've had that feeling about him all along." No, I resisted. I didn't feel anything for him during his marriage. Although I liked working with him and respected him, our relationship was strictly business-related. I could never allow myself to become that interested in a married man. "For someone who wasn't interested like that, you sure managed to spend a lot of time with him," she said with a grin. "But I had to," I replied. "He was a key part of Mr. Moffat's team. Sure, Marge replied dismissively. But after you saw his wife with Scott, the way you thought about him started to change. How were you aware of that? I let out a gasp. So you thought you had a relationship with Peter, and you hoped it would grow into something special, is that right? Marge just smiled at me before her face became serious once more. I guess so, I mutely said. After a minute of silent observation, she said, you know, you really are a dumb blonde. I angrily said, now wait just a minute, Marge. You may be my friend, but you have no right to talk to me like that. I stand by what I said. You're acting like a dumb blonde, she said, folding her arms and leaning across the table. Now keep quiet and give me a minute of your time. I believe that about half of the attendees are aware of your intense crush on Peter Hamill. However, how have you ever informed him of that? I've done a lot of things, I angrily retorted. I visit him whenever I get the chance. When he eats in the cafeteria, I make it a point to have lunch with his team. Why, did you not do that when he was married? Marge inquired. Yeah, I feigned agreement, but not very often. If your behavior doesn't indicate that your feelings have changed, how would he know? May I ask? She inquired. She insisted, have you ever even touched him? Before I could respond. No, I exclaimed, I would never do that. I mean, did you touch him with your hand or arm, or in any other way establish a physical contact with him? I lied and said, I'm sure I have, but I couldn't remember ever having done so. Are you scared to touch men in case they take it the wrong way? Maybe a little, I said. She kept staring at me until she asked, in a rhetorical manner, you know what's wrong with you, Jess? The issue lies in your excessive beauty. I started to say something, but Marge interrupted. You've been able to depend on your appearance your entire life. There was never a need to worry about finding men because they would appear out of nowhere for you. It's likely that you found your first husband, not the other way around. I glanced at the table below. Well, perhaps. He approached me at a college party the first time we ever met. And that's what I'm trying to say. You've grown accustomed to playing the victim and waiting for the guy to approach. You wave him off if he fails the test, then you just have to wait for the next one to arrive. However, but it's not just that. The truth is that you shield yourself from men, even ones in whom you might be interested, by using your beauty. However, and you act that way out of fear rather than because you're conceited or haughty. You're scared to venture out and take a chance because you think you might make a poor decision. You end up hiding behind your attractiveness in the hopes that Mr. Right will discover you and get past your barriers. I was unable to speak. Marge was not done, though. And I'll bet the reason you're so scared is that the man you did choose, the one you believed to be Mr. Right, turned out to be the worst decision you've ever made in your life. You've been hesitant to take chances and venture out ever since. Thus, while a part of you is itching to get close to Peter, a different part of you advises you to hold off and wait. You just wait around, hoping that he will eventually get past your walls and come after you. I was unable to look at her. She crossed the table, hugged me, and planted a peck on my cheek, saying, Jess, consider what I've been saying. See if there's not any truth there, please, she said before leaving. I lay in bed that night, thinking over all that Marge had said, some of it painful, some of it untrue, but I had to admit, she had been right about a lot of things. Eventually, sometime in the wee hours of the morning, I made up my mind, and even then, I slept only half asleep. I called my boss as soon as I got to work and set out to implement my plan. I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, but at least I wasn't doing nothing. Not long after I returned to my desk, Peter approached Mr. Moffat once more, and after a protracted discussion about marketing plans, the meeting ended. Before he left, however, Peter dropped by my desk and said, I'm really looking forward to working more closely with you, Jess. Peter, earlier this morning I met with HR and made arrangements for a transfer, I said as I stood up after taking a deep breath. I'm going to start working in a different department in 2 weeks. He retreated as if I had struck him in the face. But why, Jess? Have I offended you in any way? I looked at Peter, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Moffat standing in the doorway to his office, a worried expression on his face. No, Peter, it's me. You haven't done anything. I have strong feelings for you that have grown over the past few months. But I can't work for you because I intend to pursue those feelings, and the company forbids relationships between employees and their bosses. I saw Marge peeking around the corner over Peter's shoulder, but I kept my eyes fixed on Peter, waiting to see how he would react. He stared at me startled. But you never said or did anything, he said. I know, I said, glancing at Marge, but I am now. Time seemed to slow down, and I stood there, heart in my mouth, until all of a sudden, Peter stepped forward, grabbed my shoulders, said, under the circumstances, I think we can dispense with the customary 2 weeks' notice, and kissed me so passionately and promisingly that I could barely hear Marge applaud. My comment, it seems a little like a fairy tale, however. You just knew that the good-looking Peter and the beautiful Jess were going to hook up. The rival Scott was the bad guy and cheated with Peter's wife.